I'm going to share a very personal story with you today about love, courage, and choice. Toward the end of 2011, my husband Alan was diagnosed with both Alzheimer's disease and laryngeal cancer. Ultimately, he decided to voluntarily stop eating and drinking as a peaceful means to the end of his life. Sometimes I'll refer to this as VSED, voluntary stopping eating and drinking. Alan died 1 month shy of his 77th birthday, so he is not here by choice. A couple of weeks before he started this process, he was sitting at our breakfast table, and I was in the kitchen, and I glanced over at him, and I noticed that he was crying. And I said, "Honey, why are you crying? What are you feeling?" And he said these exact words, "I'm not afraid of dying. I've lived a good life, but I want everyone to know about VSED." And before I could even think of the words coming out of my mouth, I spontaneously replied, "You'll just have to trust that I'll be your vehicle." And here I am today sharing these exact words with you. Death is something most of us don't want to think about. It frightens us, and yet it beckons us. And I'm suggesting you take the time now to learn that you have more choices about how and when you die. And if you do this, and you explore this, you may have more peace and joy in your life today. I'm going to tell you my husband's and my story, and the 5 unusual choices he made in the last year and a half of his life. Alan was a very special man. I never met anyone who didn't like him. He loved to learn, and he was so curious. He played improvisational jazz piano since he was a young boy. He was a Harvard graduate. He worked with computers for his career. And for many years, we worked together in our own business and technology consulting partnership. We had a wonderful marriage for 26 years. And one of the things that I missed the most about Alan was our ability to laugh at ourselves and each other. For many years, rarely did a day go by where we didn't have a deep belly laugh. We were best friends. In 2007, we both began to notice subtle cognitive changes in Alan. In 2007 and 2009, he was examined by the neuropsychologist. The doctor could find no disease. Then for the next 4 years, we went through this medical maze, going from specialist to specialist to specialist, trying to find out, why is Alan so tired? Why doesn't he feel well? We now know that Alzheimer's begins many years before it can be detected. And finally, in 2011, Alan was diagnosed with dementia of the Alzheimer's type. And only 6 weeks later, he was also diagnosed with laryngeal cancer. For the prior 6 years, we'd been driving every 3 to 4 months to the Med Center in Seattle, and he had an HPV viral wart removed from his right vocal cord. And this is what became cancerous. It was removed with a laser. His throat surgeon said he needed to have a series of 3 invasive surgeries, and that if he didn't do this, he would most likely die a painful death within 6 to 12 months. And he was told there was a 33% chance that following the surgeries, he would not be able to breathe, speak, or swallow easily. We bought into the medical model of the day. We scheduled the first surgery, I remember, for January 4th, 2012. And while we were waiting those weeks for the surgery to occur, we asked ourselves, is surgery the only choice? And Alan made his first unusual choice. There will be no surgery. Instead, he made his second unusual choice, to follow a strict naturopathic healing protocol. I became like a drill sergeant, following him around from morning to night, making sure he took all of his supplements and followed all of his procedures throughout the day. In addition, Alan wrote a beautiful prayer, and I emailed it to many people that we knew throughout the world. And I asked them to join us in saying this prayer at 7:30 each evening. And many people did this for 4 months. And Alan and I would sit down each night at 7:30. I would read the prayer to him. And we would then visualize his healing. Because we didn't know if these healing options would work, at that point I contacted as his advocate, Compassion and Choices of Washington. They were very helpful and informative to me. And I learned about the Death with Dignity law. And we ended up going and meeting with 2 primary care physicians in Bellingham, and he did qualify for the law because of the laryngeal cancer. We had the paper prescription. I put it in our files. It had a 6-month expiration date on it. The Death with Dignity law cannot be used with Alzheimer's and some other neurological diseases. One of the requirements for the Death with Dignity law is that the person be mentally competent and in the last 6 months of life. So after all this happened, 4 months passed, and then an amazing thing happened. We went back to the throat surgeon. He examined Alan, and he could find no cancer. He said the exact words that Alan had visualized. The cancer is gone, and the HPV viral wart is gone too. Alan remained cancer-free to the last day of his life. We celebrated this good news with a large group of people who came to hear the details of this extraordinary healing. But the joy we felt that evening only lasted about 4 more weeks, because then the Alzheimer's became very apparent. And what I remember the most from that week is that together, Alan and I just cried and cried and cried. There was a fair amount of Alzheimer's in Alan's biological family. His mother had this for more than a decade. She died a shadow of a person with no physical capacities. My father also had Alzheimer's. A few days before my first date with Alan, I got an emergency phone call from my mother. She asked me to get on a plane as soon as possible and come down and help her. She couldn't take care of my father anymore, and she didn't know what to do. This was 1987. I didn't know about Alzheimer's. There weren't any support services to speak of. I got on a plane and went down there. By this point, my mother had been a caregiver for my father for many years, through a heart attack, prostate cancer, and now quite a few years of Alzheimer's. He had threatened her life on a number of occasions, and each time she would call 911, and when the police would arrive, he'd be sound asleep on the couch, not having any idea what occurred. At this point, she was also sleeping in a separate bedroom, and she would barricade the door each night with furniture, so that in case he came in to harm her, he would first fall over the furniture and wouldn't be able to get to her. This can be the nature of this cruel disease. Alan knew he was declining quickly. He was sleeping at least 16 hours a day. And now he made his 3rd unusual choice. He decided he wanted to be at his own funeral. He used to laugh and think it was very funny that people had their funerals after they died. He wanted to be present to all the love and attention. And so about 6 months before he died, while he could still speak fairly well, we held a beautiful celebration of life, and Alan talked and I talked, and many people shared their affection with Alan, and it was truly a beautiful celebration. So Alan got to be at his own funeral, but he also was clear he did not want to live into the late stages of Alzheimer's. But what option was left to him? That was when I spoke with one of the volunteer chaplains of Compassion and Choices, and she suggested I do some legal research about VSED, voluntary stopping eating and drinking. Neither Alan or I, both very well-educated people, had never heard of this. I did some legal research. I read a long white paper in the Widener Law Review by Thaddeus Pope about the legality of VSED and other legal ways to die. I shared all this information with Alan. This became an option for him. We also learned that in 1990, the Supreme Court decided that anyone can refuse life-saving medical treatment. And the Supreme Court has asserted time and again, anyone can refuse nutrition and hydration. But only a mentally competent person is capable of the consistency and discipline that is required to successfully VSED. So even the decision of a mentally competent person to VSED who is not already close to death, it's often misunderstood and misinterpreted by hospice and other long-term care providers. This was the case with our local hospice, Peace Health Whatcom Hospice. They told me they would only accept Alan when he was in the end stage of coma. I felt that he would suffer tremendously if this occurred. I was very disappointed when they told me this. In the past year, I've spoken with other medical directors of other hospices in the Seattle area. They said that they would have accepted Alan. And just this past month, a couple of people located me to help support them through the process with both of their mothers who had been accepted to a hospice in Seattle area. Both were early 90s. And one of the women was in the early to mid stages of hospice. She had a very good passing. They accepted her on the second day of her fast, and she was part of hospice. So Alan was not part of any hospice situation. It's also important to know that many health lawyers and ethicists believe that a decision to VSED by a mentally competent person is legitimate and worthy of respect. Currently, I'm working with a group of legal, medical, and academic professionals, and we're planning the first national conference on VSED to be held in Seattle at the end of next year. We've already gotten our host institution. Another situation is also occurring. There's a Dr. Stan Turman at caringadvocates.org. He has a team of people who help folks prepare living wills that state that if a person develops dementia in the future and gets to the point of no longer being able to feed him or herself, then that person's agent can be designated to request that the patient no longer be fed or given liquids. The living will is executed while the person is still mentally competent, and it states that food can be put near the person. But because the person is incapacitated to feed themselves, their death will effectively be hastened. But due to the fear of legal charges of neglect, most facilities will not do this at this time. It took Alan time to make his final decision, and while he was exploring choices, he was also one of the first people in Washington State to fill out the Alzheimer's Advanced Medical Health Directive. It protected his rights, it protected my rights as his wife while he was still alive. And you're going to hear in detail more about this directive from our last speaker today. Before Alan made his final decision to VSED, he wanted to explore one more choice. He wanted to visit a good dementia facility. And I thought this was a good idea too. I felt that we both needed to actually look at and see people in the last 1 or 2 stages of Alzheimer's living in a facility. That would help us make a more informed decision. We were fortunate. We had an excellent long-term care insurance policy that would pay the $72,000 a year that they were requesting in 2013. We went there. The place was clean and pleasant. The staff was very nice. The patients had access to outside gardens. But the faces on the people, on all the people who lived there, they were frozen. They were lifeless. And every one of them was heavily medicated. Alan and I became so shaky in the first 15 minutes of our tour, we both just held hands and cried and found a couch to sit down on. And once the tour was over and we left, as soon as we got in the parking lot, Alan turned to me and said, "I will never live there." That was his fourth unusual choice. Alan knew he could go on living for some more years. His body was physically healthy. But he also knew that his brain and his mental faculties were diminishing quickly. So he made his fifth unusual choice. He said he was going to stop eating and drinking. I told him I would support him through this process, even though this was the most difficult thing I ever had to do. I cried often, alone and with Alan, anticipating the loss of my best friend. I was in an almost constant state of anxiety, wondering how this was all going to finally resolve. After Alan made his decision, some people began to hear about it. Some people were uncomfortable and said, "This is wrong." Some of you right now might be thinking, that was wrong. Why did he stop eating and drinking? He was still mentally competent. He had some quality of life left. He could walk a little. He could talk a little. He could eat. Some people wondered, is he committing suicide? Is he doing this so Phyllis won't have to struggle? But there's a very important distinction to be made here between suicide and Alan's choice. Our words matter. Let's use them very carefully. Suicide is about saying no to life. Suicide is violent and outside the natural order in terms of how we actually die. It's an emotional decision and perception, and usually done with emotional imbalance. It hurts oneself. It can be devastating to others, and it has to be done secretively. By contrast, Alan was saying yes to life up to his last breath. His decision was about self-love and peace and compassion. He made a conscious, deliberate, informed decision to have an organic death and let his body break down naturally by means of not eating and drinking. He honored life up to his last breath. And once he made his decision to be not here by choice, he lived in a state of deep, calm, accepting presence. And he spoke these actual words to me 2 months before he died. "I am comfortable and at ease with everything. I just feel great all the time, even when I'm tired. I'd love to help people reduce their suffering. People notice how happy I look, and I think that's important because I'm really at the end of this life. I'm sure it goes on. I don't know how to share this with other people. It's up to you, Phyllis, to do that." And also about 6 weeks before he started his fast, I was visiting a close friend for a few days in Tucson, and I called Alan every morning and every evening. One night he told me that as he was falling asleep, people who have passed over were waiting for him. He said, quote, "What I see is a living, moving picture, not a static picture," unquote. He says he thinks his family is waiting, his mother, his father, his aunts, his uncles. He says this in soft, relaxed tones with absolutely no fear. He says the experience is real. His voice is gentle, as if he is almost already living this reality. I asked him, "Are you beginning to look forward to what comes next more than what you have now?" And he said yes. He said he thinks people have a lot of control over when they pass. And he said with certainty that he would be able to communicate with me after he passes. About 3 weeks before he started the VSED process, with tears in his eyes, he said, "Since I don't know about this, probably not a lot of people do, and it sounded horrible. Now that I've investigated it, it doesn't sound horrible, and I'm going to VSED." I kept checking in with Alan over and over and over to make absolutely certain he was clear about this decision. He finally got to the point of saying to me, "Please, don't ask me anymore. I've made up my mind. This is what I'm going to do." Although I supported Alan's decision, I was completely heartbroken. I was going to lose my husband. I wanted us to grow old together. I wasn't going to get to live the last chapter of my life with him. I cried a lot. We cried together. I did my best not to cry in front of him too much. He knew how difficult this was for me. He also knew that this was my personal journey that I had to deal with, and he was taking his own personal journey. I had professional support and a community of friends to help me through this process. And I knew that the only way I would ever get through the grief was to actually go through it and experience it. Even though some people were uncomfortable with Alan's decision, the truth is that after he was no longer with us, many people came forward and expressed what a profound effect his choice had on them. People perceived his actions as loving and courageous. They saw dignity in his death. It was a demonstration of his civil rights. And many people felt deep relief knowing that this option's available to them someday, if necessary. Alan identified a marker so he would know when it was time to start the process. And this was it. He was the keyboard player for 7 years at our Center for Spiritual Living. This center represented love and community to him. When he was sleeping so much, 16 to 18 hours a day, and no longer had the energy to leave the house and be able to go to the center anymore, he said he was done. I remember that conversation as if it was happening right now. And in that same conversation, I said to him, "And I think that in a couple more months, you will no longer be mentally competent, and you won't be able to follow through with your decision." So at that point, we consulted with a few more people, and Alan set an exact date as to when to start. Alan had been seeing an excellent doctor for some years, and for many months prior to him starting the VSED process, we both talked with her privately about his wishes. So when our local hospice said they wouldn't help him until the end stage of coma, I called her, and she just immediately said, "Then I'm going to step forward. I'm going to take care of Alan." She knew how important this was to him. She knew he was still mentally competent, and she knew that he was declining quickly, both physically and mentally. 5 days before he started the process, he only ate 500 calories a day to get a jump start on the process. Also, several days before he started, as a precaution, our elder care attorney came over to the house. She had written up papers, and we witnessed and notarized them at the table. And these papers were to protect me, his doctor, and the 2 caregivers. I also had a copy of his health directive, a copy of the Alzheimer's Advanced Mental Health Directive, and a copy of that long white paper from the Widener Law Review about the legality of VSED. This came in quite handy because someone in our community did call Adult Protective Services, and on the 3rd morning of his fast, I got 10 minutes notice with a phone call, and they said they were coming by to investigate the situation. They did. It was actually an opportunity for me to educate them about this. I actually said that I would come into their office and do a class, but they haven't invited me. I had all of the papers, and somehow I just went into this state where I was very together, and I went through every paper systematically. She took a ton of notes, and she wrote a very positive report, and nothing came of it. Alan actually told the doctor at the beginning of the process that he wanted to remain as conscious as possible and receive as little medication as possible. He had only small amounts of medication for the first several days, but as his body began to break down and he began to get more dehydrated, she increased the medication. She stayed one step ahead of him throughout the whole process. I wanted to make absolutely certain he didn't suffer at all. The relationship between a patient and a doctor in this situation is very important. The key to success in using VSED is having a supportive physician who's willing to prescribe medications to lessen anxiety and discomfort as the body begins to shut down. It is ideal if the physician is not at all hesitant about prescribing sufficient medication to sedate the patient if requested and desired. In addition, Alan prepared himself emotionally. He had already had his celebration of life. He got the necessary emotional support and resolved important issues in his life, and he felt very loved at this point. You can find out a lot of detail about all the things I'm talking about today, especially the medical and legal preparations, by looking at my website, PhyllisShacter.com. And I did put some cards at the back that just will help you get to the link easily. And the TED Talk that I gave about this story is also on the website. It took Alan 9.5 days to be not here by choice. Once he started, he never looked back. He basically just went to bed and stopped eating and drinking. He didn't complain nor say he was hungry. On the 4th and 5th days, he asked me for water. And both times I explained to him why he wasn't eating and drinking and reminded him that water would extend this process. And then I said to him, "But I'll do whatever you want me to do. So would you like me to give you a glass of water? Or would you rather that I just spray mists of water into your mouth until you're satisfied?" And both times, he just asked for the mists of water. Also on my website, I've actually included the log that we kept during those 9.5 days so that you can get a really good, clear idea about what it is like for somebody who dies this way. Our doctor made 3 house calls during the 9.5 days. She was on 24-hour call by phone. There were a number of times we did have to call her in the middle of the night. Our long-term care insurance policy paid for us to have 2 caregivers round the clock. Now, although I believe that it's important to have some professional assistance in caregiving during this process, I know that a lot of people aren't. First of all, a lot of people don't have long-term care insurance policies, and a lot of people aren't going to be able to even afford the round-the-clock care. But there's a lot of ways of doing this. Some people's friends and family will get some training and they'll help. Some people will step in the last days and help when it's more critical. There are choices around this. Also on the blog of my website there's an actual list of supplies that are needed to care for somebody while they're going through the VSED process. And, of course, if somebody is fortunate enough to be at home and under hospice care, they're going to get a lot of good support that way. Alan was so grateful for the good care he was receiving from all the people who were helping him during these days that he kept thanking the people for as long as he could. Thank you. Thank you. He kept saying thank you. As long as Alan was conscious, his daughter called daily from California, and I put the speakerphone by his ear so he could hear her. And by the 5th day, I began to spend a lot of time with Alan in bed, in that little small hospital bed, because it was very comforting to both of us. And on the 6th day, while I was in bed with him, he began to speak in metaphorical language. Very softly and slowly, he said, "I've got to get the milk. The people are at the party. What time is it? And when Alan could no longer speak or open his eyes, I wanted to make absolutely certain he was comfortable. So I got very close to him at his bedside and I said, Alan, I am here with you. If you are comfortable, blink your eyes. And with his eyes still closed, he moved them, and I knew he was all right. And while he was in this state, he was able to mouth his last words to me. I love you. By the 9th day, Alan was in a deep coma with loud, rapid breathing. Our doctor examined him this morning and said he was only going to live. She said actually he was probably going to live another 1 to 3 more days because his heart was still strong and healthy. But I felt Alan was really no longer with us at that point. He was in a deep coma, and I wanted to help him release from his body. And I wasn't sure just what to do. So soon after the doctor left, I went into his bedroom and closed the doors behind me, and I just stood by him at his bedside, and I waited. And then it came to me. And then I began to actively do therapeutic touch, which is a deep healing energy modality that I learned from nurses many years ago. And I did that for a while. And then I was done with that, and then I just waited. And then I found myself talking to Alan. It sounded more like a pep talk. Alan, we've partnered together for 26 years. We've supported each other through everything. And this is our last partnership. I'm so proud of you. You've been so courageous. You're getting your wish, honey. You're not going to have to live into the late stages of Alzheimer's. I'm going to help usher you home. And then he's still laying there, breathing loudly and fast. And then I heard myself starting to sing some beautiful sacred music that was very meaningful to me. And it was music that was familiar to Alan. And then I began to talk to Alan some more. And while I was talking to him, and I'm not exaggerating at all, I felt myself look up and to the right, and I said, Alan, you're not even in your body. You've already left. Honey, you can let go now. You're only holding on by a couple of threads. You've been so courageous. There's nothing left for you to do. I want you to know I'm going to be all right. You can let go now. I'm going to help midwife you home. And while I was saying those words, Alan's breath shifted abruptly from to a few Those last breaths were so gentle, I couldn't even detect the last breath, and he left. Instead of it taking another 1 to 3 more days, like the doctor had said that morning, he left with me loving him, talking to him, partnering with him by his side in 15 minutes. Every step of the way, Alan made his choices. He chose not to have surgery. He chose naturopathic healing. He chose to be at his own funeral. He chose not to live in a dementia facility. And his final decision to be not here by choice brought him great peace. Everyone needs to know that we have legal rights and choices about how and when we die. It's not up to our doctors or anyone else. Alan's choices may be different than the ones you will make. But it is my hope that we are all empowered to participate in the planning of our own death, so we each can have the same kind of peace that my husband experienced. It's now almost 2.5 years since Alan died. I went through a very deep grieving process for a long time. But now I am feeling joy again. I'm very grateful for my life. And I'm very grateful for the years I spent with Alan. The legacy that he has left me is one of love, courage, and the knowing that all is well eternally. Even though I miss Alan, I'm glad he didn't have to live into the late stages of Alzheimer's disease. My support of my husband through his process, his choice to die peacefully and consciously, was my biggest act of love. Thank you very much.